Yeah, I want to pick up on one of Barbara's last comments there about students facing a mountain of debt and shot at entering the precariat. And so I'm going to devote my comments to education debt because I feel that's a very important part of the picture in fleshing out what the precariat is. And household debt, not just about financing education, of course, it's about how people have kept their heads above the water for the last 30 years or so, which is the general time period in which it makes sense to talk about the rise of the precariat. If you drew up, in fact, if you drew up a graph showing the increase in temporary work contracts over that period, 3 decades, the march of temping from low-wage service sector all the way up into the professions, and academia is just the most rapidly casualized of all the professions. The curve in that graph would be strikingly similar to a graph showing the rise of household debt over that same period. It's cheap credit that has kept the precarious work economy afloat. And just as a lot of people see the distinguishing feature of precarity as an uncertainty about the future, radical uncertainty about the future, the thing you can say about household debt is that it locks in the future, it forecloses the future. Why? Because for most people, debts are the wages of the future, to which creditors lay claim far in advance. And each new surrender of a part of our lives to personal debt financing, in a way, further consumes the fruits of labor that we haven't yet performed in the shape of compensation that we have not yet earned. Now, and that's why I think of debts, including education debts, probably most particularly education debts, as a form of premature wage theft, and why the debtors' movement that we need to come into being in the decades to come is in many ways just a natural extension of the labor movement. Now, economists are currently telling us that it's safe to start borrowing again. Household debt went into decline a little after 2008, but from mid-2013, all the numbers started to rise. Housing, credit cards, automobile loans, and education of debt, of course, never went into decline. It's surpassed $1.3 trillion now with record levels of default. Economists tell us that the debt overhang from 2008 has been resolved and it's safe to start borrowing again. This is bad analysis and bad advice. It's what they teach in these economics departments. Debt overhang is one of these dodgy concepts that economists roll out to rationalize an otherwise unsustainable situation. And the truth of the matter is that we're living in the kind of capitalist society, I call it a creditocracy, where most people are so deeply in debt, and it's debt that can never be repaid. It will never be repaid. And the gut response to that is to say, well, that's not fair. How can we be in debt that we never have a chance to repay? And why would the banks want that anyway? Well, that's missing the point, because creditors don't want us to pay down our debts entirely. For the same reason, the credit card issuers don't want you to clear your monthly balance. If you do that, they're not profiting from you. You're getting credit for free. And in the industry, they call you a deadbeat if you do that. That's the term they use. They don't want deadbeats, they want revolvers. Revolvers are the people who can't make their monthly balance, pay the minimum, pay the late fees, the penalties, and roll over the principal. So the goal really in this kind of society we're living in now is to make lifelong revolvers of all of us, to keep us on the hook as long as we possibly can until the day we die. Because if we pay off our debts, we're no longer generating income for the creditor class. And that's one of the reasons why we're seeing demographically the shift in the household debt burden towards the elderly, a marked demographic shift. And one of the factors there is that parents and grandparents increasingly have to co-sign the student loans of their grandchildren or their children. I could go on and on and on about how this poses a grave threat to democracy. We have elected officials now who cannot check the power of the creditor class, and that's a very grave threat to democracy. But let's just stick to education, because that's our topic for today. Last week's big news here in Capitol Hill, of course, was President Obama's proposal to fund community colleges from the federal purse. And it kind of overshadowed another announcement, which was a report from the General Accounting Office and an estimate from them that America's public colleges now take in more money from debt-financed student tuition than they do from all other state sources. So the more money is coming directly from the students and their families than from all other state sources. Let's just take this tipping point statistic as historical confirmation, if you like, that we've reached the point where education is no longer perceived or treated as a public good by our elected officials. Now, that's not the case in other parts of the world. We know there's a long list of industrialized countries that offer free student enrollment either as an investment in their 21st century economies or because it's a basic citizenly right. In this country, we've turned higher education, a vital social good, into the cruelest of debt traps. And it's a debt trap from which only students from well-heeled families can escape. The worst burden falls on low-income households, minorities, first-generation immigrant families, whose lack of access to information and financial advice makes them very easy prey for predatory lenders and unscrupulous admissions officers of colleges, especially for-profit colleges. And if you think about the righteous demands of the civil rights movement, one of the most righteous demands was that collegiate doors be open to minority populations that had been denied the fruits of higher education. And if you take a step backwards and look at the response, the structural response over the last 50 years, you would be justified in concluding that the right to education has been replaced by the right to access education loans. Just as the right to housing has also been replaced by an expanded right to access housing loans. Now, I am naive enough, I'm an educator, full-time educator. I'm naive enough to think of higher education still as an incubator for a free-thinking, active citizenry. But in many ways, it's becoming the opposite, which is a chop shop for the life opportunities and the optional political imagination of young people being downsized, radically downsized, in order to meet the lifelong demands of financial contracts. Right? That's a very blunt way of looking at it, but increasingly that's the way I see it, as a racket. And the racket extends now into high school culture, because increasingly what we see is that debt counseling is a central component of all college recruitment advising that goes on now in high schools. So it's penetrated very deeply into K through 12 culture. We've seen at least one or two generations of students delivered now into a condition that some people describe as akin to indenture. Now, that's a very strong word, and people take exception to its use. But actually, if you consider the essence of indenture is that you have to go into debt in order to labor, then it's actually a pretty accurate description when it comes down to it. An ever-increasing share of the wages, precarious wages at that, of college graduates must now go to service the debt taken on simply to prepare themselves for employability in the first place. And we're not just talking about education debt here, we're also talking about all of the costs of meeting the physical and mental requirements that are increasingly insisted upon for modern knowledge economy work. Getting the requisite mind-body balance which involves diet, which involves physical toning, which involves psychological stability. All of these things are very costly. And not just education alone, and they're all debt financed. So my students, increasingly what I see is that they look at the time and the resources that are required to meet all of these thresholds, these requirements, and they see them as a hedge, and I use the financial term advisedly, a hedge against falling below the threshold of employability in the decades to come. And that's a very calculating outlook. It's one, of course, that as an educator I regret, think it's tragic, but I can't blame my students for approaching this process of credentialism in that kind of transactional way that reflects the financialization of our society. Now, high schoolers are told, and I'm sure you've all heard this statistic, high schoolers are told that recipients of college degrees earn twice as much as those who are trying to compete in the workforce economy only with a high school diploma, right? You've all heard that statistic. Well, let's not get into how untrue it is, but the statistic you haven't heard or you don't hear very often is that less than 30% of the jobs in the American workforce actually require a college degree. Think about that. And by one estimate, over half of the college graduates currently employed are in jobs that do not require a 4-year college education. Now, if you take those statistics simply as a basis for supply and demand analysis, you'd be justified in concluding that there's an overproduction of graduates, right? If you're that kind of economist and you treat education in that way, an overproduction of graduates, and yet the aggregate output of graduates in this country is often unfavorably compared by officials from President Obama all the way down to the counterparts in China and Japan and Korea. And the insistence is that we have to get this quota up. We have to get output up, as if it's some sort of industrial productivity quota in order to compete with these other countries. How warped is that? You have this chronic mismatch between a national educational policy, you could call it an industrial policy, that is aimed at increasing degree growth targets, while at the same time there is no industrial policy to speak of aimed at creating the kind of high road jobs that would absorb a surplus graduate population. So increasing the growth targets will only have one result under those circumstances, and that is to increase, expand, and deepen the debt trap. There are solutions to this. Just to conclude, there are solutions we could talk about. But in general, getting return on investment mentality out of the picture is crucial. Reducing that the mentality of approaching education as a transactional and vocational commodity is crucial. And of course, there are long lists, as I said earlier, of industrialized countries in which higher education is seen differently, where it's regarded as a vital public good and not as a vehicle for creditor profit, which is increasingly turning into in this country. And this really feeds into, I think, one of the questions that Jenny was asking, who bears the fiscal responsibility? If we really had an honest discussion about fiscal accountability in higher education, we'd have to respond to parents who, as I do, increasingly, who ask, why does college cost so much? How is this possible? And when you turn around and say, well, it's not because of the cost of instructional labor, that's for sure, because those costs have been sliced in the last 20 or 30 years, largely because of casualization. Well, then why does it cost so friggin' much? There are many answers to that question, but a lot of them have to do, I think, with the rise of the precariat. A lot of them have to do with the inequality within the academic workforce, But ultimately, some of them have to do with power over the workplace. Sometimes it's just not like all other workplaces, sometimes it's not a question of efficiency or rights or even cost cutting. It's about establishing managerial control over the workplace. And I haven't gone very much into that, but I think many of you in the audience are sufficiently versed in that debate to know how that applies also to the academic workforce.
Thank you.